And I'm ready to welcome back on stage Robin, who will go into a fire chat with a first person, which is Saul Klein. And he's the founding partner at LocalGlobe and Latitude Ventures. And previously, he was a general partner at Index Venture. He currently also serves on the UK Government Digital Economy Council, and most recently, he founded Platoon, which was acquired by Apple in 2018. Also, Zinc, Kano, and Seedcamp, and I don't think we need an introduction to this audience of those companies, but as well being the co-founder and original CEO of LoveFilm, which was acquired by Amazon in 2011. Also being part of the original executive team at Skype, acquired by eBay in 2005. So I think we can say he is what you call a serial entrepreneur. Very much interested in the seed capital and the early stage of companies, but also believing of the positive impact that technology has on society. So I think he is the ideal guest for Robin to talk about how we can scale the European tech. Give him an applause.
Thank you, Suryan. Such a pleasure to have Saul here.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm going to tell you why. It's because when I did a conference called Plug in Brussels here. And I started organizing it 15 years ago. And the first one happened 14 years ago, March 2008. And one of the first people I contacted was Saul. Didn't know him. Contacted him out of the blue, said, like, listen, I'm doing this European startup event. Would you like to come? He immediately said yes. Gave a hell of a presentation about where European tech is going, how big is it going to get, how fast is it going to grow. This is 2008, when it wasn't that obvious yet. And I remember that presentation so well that I couldn't not invite him for the first Tech.eu Summit and invite him back and to see if all of his predictions back then actually came true or beyond that. So Saul, thank you so much for being back in Brussels with me.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it.
Really great to be here.
So Suryan already gave your bio, so we don't need to go over all of that.
Just showed I'm old.
We could go straight to the point. Do you remember your presentation back then?
I remember it extremely well. In fact, even before you kindly or unkindly reposted the video, yeah, no, that presentation for me was the first time I think someone had forced me to articulate very clearly why I felt, Europe was such an amazing opportunity for early stage startups and innovation. Obviously, I'd started Seedcamp, I think, the year before, or a year or two before with Reshma, and that was very much motivated by the fact that, there was a lot more to do in Europe, and I'd seen with Skype, this idea that you don't have to be in the valley to build a great global tech company. But yeah, you kind of challenged me to sort of articulate it and I think that's always a really useful exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. Now what you're saying seems obvious. You don't need to be in the valley to build big companies. It can happen in Europe. Now it seems obvious. Back then it still was, you didn't hear that much, especially not from investors, actually, if I have to say.
No, look, I mean, I saw this myself as a founder in 2002. I moved back from the US, where I'd been from 95 to 2002. I moved to London, and when we started LoveFilm, I mean, there were only really 2 VCs still investing in at least consumer internet. So, I was lucky that Index actually, led my Series A. They brought in what was then Benchmark Europe, now Balderton. But really, European venture at that point was tumbleweed. And, the global ecosystem, never mind the Euro ecosystem, was kind of dancing on the grave of the internet following the sort of the 9/11 and the bubble bursting. Everyone's saying, those stupid kids, the dot-com era, these guys, you can forget about them. And of course, then, yourself, I think, Tim O'Reilly did a conference a Web 2.0 conference in Berlin. Mike Arrington brought sort of TechCrunch to Europe, and Mike Butcher was, the first editor. You worked with him there, and there was some people back then who were saying, things are going to happen here, but it was a small room. It wasn't a huge conference center.
Yeah. And could you have predicted that it would have grown as fast and as big as it has, especially in the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years?
Look, I think the thing about networks, which we all know, I mean, it's network theory. It's not like, social networks, whatever. I mean, this is much more grounded and rooted in network theory. Networks compound, and the pace at which they compound speeds up over time. So the phrase we use a lot internally is that it took us 20 years to get to the starting line, and I would say 2022 is the starting line, and it's really the next 20 years where it gets exciting. So, Europe is still considered by most LPs globally, the people who invest in funds, to be, an emerging market relative to established markets like the US or China, which is less easy to invest in now, or emerging markets like India, or specialist markets like Israel. And it's actually the thing I have seen change in the last 3 years is LPs and US GPs, all of the people who've come to London to set up shop, we can talk about that if you like, have moved Europe from being a frontier market, literally, to an emerging market. We're not an established market, and we probably won't be for another maybe 10 years.
Yeah. We're speaking about Europe like it's one whole, but of course it's not. It's a collection of different innovation ecosystems, loosely connected sometimes tightly.
Like it for the last 1,000 years. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's been fragmented forever. So it's nothing new, but does it make it particularly difficult for an investor to stay on top of what's happening in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, etc.?
I think less so nowadays. I mean, and obviously this was the key thing that we were trying to address with Seed Camp is, the idea that innovation wasn't centralized, but it was decentralized, was, in a sense, something that we really recognized was different in Europe from what Y Combinator was doing. If you look at Y Combinator, they started off both in Boston and San Francisco, and then they centralized further to San Francisco. When we started Seed Camp, and I mean, if you're interested, you can go back and read the blog post I wrote in February 2007 called Why Europe. And, the point was that, we couldn't just copy and paste Y Combinator for our ecosystem. We had to do something very different and take a very federated approach. So while we had London and then Berlin as some central hubs, Reshma, myself, and then Reshma and Carlos would go, and Philip Mooring, who's now at Tiny VC, would go out and do these like mini seed camps in Prague, in Ljubljana, and all over Europe. And through that, Reshma met the folks at, I think, Credo, and through meeting the folks at Credo, Seed Camp became investors in UiPath.
Right, so a network effect on its own, in a way.
Well, it's just basically having a different thesis to discovering innovation than they have in the Bay Area, which is drive to me.
No. So you're saying we're at the starting line now, finally, which means the best is yet to come. What needs to happen for that to actually come true? What barriers still exist that need to be removed to really, really make that happen?
Look, I think, the commissioner mentioned some great initiatives. It sounds like the EU is taking, the UK government, has been taking similar initiatives as well. As I said, I think we're in this kind of compounding phase where, there's more capital, there's more talent, there's more entrepreneurs, and those three things are kind of those three dimensions, if you like, are the dimensions that the Valley has. And I believe while, the Valley will likely still, for the next 20 to 50 years, still be the preeminent innovation ecosystem globally, the area that we call New Palo Alto, a 4-hour train ride from King's Cross, or a 4-hour train ride from Brussels, which is already, by the numbers, the third best ecosystem globally after the Bay Area and Beijing for producing unicorns and futurecorns, that network effect is now in full effect. And there's very little you can do to slow that down, especially as new capital is coming in from the US, is coming in from Asia, is coming in from EIF, is coming in from pension funds. I think all of that's happening. And for me, the special source of this ecosystem, which they don't have in the US and they don't really have in China to the same degree, are these sort of additional pillars of academia or sort of primary research where Europe is world-class. I mean, again, New Palo Alto has 7 out of the world's top 30 universities, not Europe's top 30, the world's top 30. And then, you know, if you believe, which we do, that innovation and regulation need to kind of work hand in hand, especially when you're addressing kind of critical parts of society and the economy, like housing, energy, education, healthcare, food security, etc., it's helpful to have government on your doorstep. I mean, I worked in the US at Microsoft in the late 90s where we were being sued by the DOJ in Washington, and we were being, you know, investigated by DG15 in Brussels. And I would have to go to Washington and I'd have to go to Brussels to persuade regulators like, hey, you know, we're moving too fast. Don't worry, like, we got this covered. Like, where did that all end up?
Yeah, yeah. So with LocalGlobe, you're investing early stage. With Latitude, seed stage.
Different from early.
Seed.
A lot of people like to conflate the two.
Yeah,
Seed is a bit different.
So you invest in seed very early. With Latitude, you invest a bit later stage, and you might even go later stage at a later stage in the fund as well. What I'm interested in is where do you take most of the pleasure from? Do you like still meeting like those first-time founders who really don't have a clue yet, but a good idea, good background? Do you still like to be in the trenches with those people?
Definitely, and you know, we've got an investment team of 12 now, but I'm still very engaged with making new investments. But you know, building a firm that is able to make investments, have a team, you know, that's a business as well. And so, you know, as an entrepreneur, as an operator, I really enjoy that part of what we do, as well as making the investments. And then, you know, the other thing which, you know, I believe is sort of central to how our ecosystem is going to be different from these others is that, you know, what we've done in our business is we allocate 10% of profits in our management company and 2% of carry in all of our funds to a foundation, which we call Phoenix Court Works. And that, you know, like you forced me to articulate a sort of a vision for Europe 25 years ago, what that forces us to do is to bake into the economics of our business impact. Or like, you know, the focus on actually doing good, not just doing well. And the primary focus for that is our neighborhood around our office in Somerstown in London, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in London and therefore the UK. And I think, you know, if innovation is going to work, it needs to work for everyone. And that means we have to address inequality, not just opportunity.
That's very admirable, and I hope people in the room also take lessons from that and inspiration. What's next? I mean, the next 20 years are going to be the best to come. How can you play a role? How can everyone in this room play a role? What skills do they need to have? What focus do they need to have to really make the next 20 years the best for Europe?
Look, I mean, as I said, I think the fundamental flywheel is turning, and there's very little that can sort of take that away. What I would sort of encourage people to think about is how can we use the things that are special and different about Europe to create a different type of innovation. And I think those two additional dimensions that we have here in a way that is really potentially game-changing is the sort of the inclusion of deep and fundamental research. You know, we've got universities in Europe that are 1,000 years old. So we've got deep history, cultural history, intellectual history. And then the other aspect is just having a different relationship to government, both local and national and regional government than people have in the US and China. And I think if we can embrace those two dimensions and figure out how to bake that into an integrated innovation ecosystem, we will genuinely do something different. And the problems that we need to solve are societal problems. They're not just technology problems, and they're not just economic problems. So I think that's my hope. We don't have, by any means, all of the answers, but that's where we're kind of focusing our efforts.
Great. Just to conclude our talk, let's get some hands-on advice. Because you've been a founder, you've been an entrepreneur, you've been an investor, you've talked to more entrepreneurs than I can imagine. What is still the biggest mistake that they make? What is still the biggest lesson that they need to learn from the get-go from someone like you who's seen it all?
Look, I think one of the founders we backed about 6 or 7 years ago, when he came to talk to us about an investment, he presented his Wikipedia page 10 years from now. And we took that idea, and then every time we work with founders to start their investing, our journey with them, we have what we call is a wiki lab. And we ask them to prepare their Wikipedia page 10 years from now, which sort of, pushes them to articulate in writing, not sort of like broad brushes, but, we've got 10,000 people, we've got 3,000 offices, we're generating this much revenue. We decided not to go public in Amsterdam. We chose to go public in New York. We had this controversy around a privacy scare. We had X, Y, Z. So it helps people to sort of visualize the future. And I think thinking long term and really aiming high and continually referring back to why are you doing this and why do you still want to be doing this 10 years from now, sort of the best advice I can give anyone about anything, quite frankly. It doesn't matter about doing a startup. You want to do something you're committed to and you will do for the long term. So I think, just thinking long term, thinking through not what could go right, but some of the things that could go wrong, and how do you sort of bake that into your DNA? I think that's a very good exercise, and I'm always happy to read anyone's Wikipedia page.
Great. Well, that's a piece of inspiring advice if I ever heard one. Saul, thank you so much for being back in Brussels, and I hope to see you back next year as well.
Thank you.